everybody, today we're going to take a little walk down memory lane and discuss some of my first few corsets, how much they cost, as well as what I learned from each of them. And this is inspired by day 15 of 30 Days of Corsets, in which they ask how much I spent on my very first corset. But because either I struggle with question interpretation or because I'm an overachiever, or both, I don't want to talk about just my very first corset. I've tried well over 200 corsets, and it's too boring to talk about my very first one because it was kind of like a slow, gradual progression into getting into real corsetry with a whole lot of like fake bustiers prior to that. So I'm going to discuss some of my first off-the-rack corsets, custom corsets, and homemade corsets as well. And for each of these, I will post reviews or case studies up in the cards above and down in the description below if you want more information on any of these. So my very first corsety style garment, which I don't really think counts as a real corset, was from Burlesque, and it was purchased in a kind of like punk alternative store in Montreal. I think it was $89 Canadian, and after tax it was close to $100. It was a bit of a disappointment though, because it pulled in my waist maybe by an inch, but it had plastic boning in it, and so that ended up softening to my body heat and kinking and warping and poking into my ribs very uncomfortably. And within a couple of months, the busk also started coming through the seam, and so I basically had to harvest the hardware from that corset, which was basically just the busk, because the other hardware was plastic and I couldn't really use it. So it did not last me very long at all. It was a bit of a disappointment. So obviously that was a costume piece, not for tight lacing or waist training. So I would not really consider that a real corset. My first official, real off-the-rack purchased corset was by Timeless Trends. It was the green silk and brocade piece, the emerald piece, which apparently is now on like limited edition or clearance. Perhaps Timeless Trends' new owners are getting rid of it. They're clearing it out. So it might not exist for very much longer, which is a little bit sad. But if you've been following me long enough, you know the whole story here. I did a reading of the introduction of Solace where I talk about my own story and how I got started in corsetry. If you're interested in that sort of thing, and I talk about this emerald green corset and what I've learned from it. So I'm not going to rehash all of that here. But if you're interested in learning more about that, I'll link it up in the cards and down in the description below. And that cost $99 US before shipping. Shipping to Canada was about, I think, another $28 at the time. So paid close to $130 after shipping. My very first custom purchased corset was the front lacing closed back corset from Berserk in the UK, who he was actually had a background in engineering and decided to make corsets because his then fiance was a corset maker who now owns Bound by Obsession. Actually, they're married now, but he is no longer making corsets. I think he was only making corsets for maybe a year or maybe even a few months. But there were some fitting issues, and I have discussed that in a previous video called Why I No Longer Recommend Front Lacing Corsets. So Berserk was only around for a very short time. I'm not sure if he was testing the waters to see how he liked the corset industry, or if he was just sort of like apprenticing or helping out his then fiance at the time, trying to take on some extra orders. But the corsets were extremely affordable. I think they were around $75 to $80 US. So he was probably selling them for probably close to 50 pounds sterling at the time. But yeah, unfortunately, that corset did not work that great for me. And it's not solely Berserk's fault either. It was partially my own inexperience and purchasing a corset that was too small that I was ready for. So I go into that whole story. I'll link it up in the cards and down below. My first custom corset commission that was a properly fitting back-laced custom corset was by Heavenly Corsets, also known as L Corsets, also in the UK. Unfortunately, that came with its own fitting issues as well. But it was a very strong corset, I will say that, at least. But it had a lot of bowing issues in the back. I ended up replacing the the narrow steel bones in the back with stronger more rigid ones. And I also added more grommets in the back and changed up the lacing. It was made with satin couture, which I really, really loved. That was the point that I just fell in love with satin couture, because it had virtually no stretch to it. It was a beautiful, bright red color. And the silhouette was really lovely as well, because it was my first semi-experience into a sort of mid-hip or long line corset. And so I just loved the contours of it, and it had a very conical rib cage as well. A lot of people don't like the stitch work of Heavenly corsets, especially the waist training corsets, because she does a zigzag over every seam. So every seam I think is stitched something like 4 times. So it is very strong, but it doesn't look too great. And sometimes the zigzag it's a little bit veering off, so it can look a bit messy. But I don't know. I mean, I had defended that corset to the death at the time, because I loved it so much. But as I got more experience and I tried other custom corsets, I realized that there are benefits to doing things a different way, and there are benefits to corsets that fit differently. And I don't really see them on social media, so I don't know how active they are anymore. But there are obviously a lot of other amazing corset makers out there that I have tried and that I would like to try in the future. So my first proper homemade corset, which I can't really call proper because it was made from bedsheet, but anyways, my first corset that was not made from like an old long line bra that I had nipped in the waist or something. I had made that Victorian Simplicity corset somewhere around when I was like 18 years old. And that was before there was any kind of tutelage available on the internets, and or at least any that I've had seen at that point. There might have been the live journal groups available at that point, although I'm not really sure, because I didn't end up joining those until I was like probably 22-ish. But yeah, I had to go with a historically questionable simplicity pattern at the time. The most expensive part of that corset was the busk, because I did not know how to order anything online at the time. So I think I ended up buying my first busk at Anime North, and I just bought it from a vendor. It was like $20. So that was probably too much for me to pay for just a standard flexible busk at the time, but you know, beggars can't be choosers. Like I said, the fabric was made out of old bed sheets, so I didn't really have to pay for that. The grommets cost me about $12, I think, from Fabricland, and we already had the hand press for it, although that really hurt my hands. So I didn't have the table press at the time. The bones were a combination of acrylic and steel boning. So the steel boning came from these old back braces, probably from the 1970s, and I found those braces at Goodwill for like $14. So I bought those and I took them apart, and I feel really bad about that because I can't remember very much about them. I don't think they were antique camp corsets. I think they were just kind of like, they were really, really ugly back braces. But I still feel bad about taking them apart. And so I took some of the bones from that, but they were too short because those were for an underbust back brace, like a lumbar brace, and I was making a mid-bust corset. So what I did was I took those really short steel bones and I put it like right at the waistline where it had the most tension, and then I filled up the rest of the boning channel with the plastic acrylic featherweight boning. And so the featherweight boning probably cost me, I don't know, maybe $10 or something. And then the twill tape that I used, not as a waist tape, but as the boning channels themselves, that probably cost me another like $4 or something. So the simplicity pattern cost $10. So in total, I probably spent about $80 Canadian on this heap of garbage. That I did learn a lot from it, don't get me wrong, but I mean, like, it is really embarrassing as a first corset, and I have seen like so many other people make a first corset that was like better than my third or fifth or 10th corset out there. So but then again, I did not have any of these online tutorials at the time, so I had to work with what I got. So yes, $80, not including all the time and labor that I put in. However, this did spark my personal interest in corsetry and a definite appreciation for all the steps that go into the construction of it and the art of it. And that led to another almost 15 years of more research and a hobby that has now cost me several tens of thousands of dollars over the last decade. So that I get was, how much was that? That was my first homemade corset, my first 2 custom corsets, and my first 2 kind of off the rack corsets. That's how much I spent on my very first 5 corsets, different types of corsets for different eras of my life. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was a little bit of a laugh for you. Let me know what your first corset was in a comment down below if you're comfortable sharing. And if you want to talk about how much you spent on your first corset or corsets, whether they're off the rack, custom, homemade, whichever, yeah, feel free to leave a comment down below and continue this discussion. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next week for another video. Bye.